Alrighty, Jake here with TrendSpider. Happy Friday. Hopefully everybody had a great week. We're going to go over the broad markets and we're going to touch on all the same charts that we have touched on over the last 2 weeks. Why are we doing this? Mainly because I want to go over the same charts and show you guys what has worked, what hasn't worked, and kind of go from there. So starting with SPY, the main thing that was really important on Thursday was this breakout through this inverse head and shoulders neckline. You can see a lot of volume aggregating above this level on Thursday, and then we had a really strong continuation today on Friday, and we'll have to see what happens into next week. But this bull flag breakout on the weekly chart is really something to take note of. Remember, we want to anchor the volume by price from this March capitulation point. You can see there's this huge volume shelf here that initially acted as supply last week and then acted as a demand zone and a launch pad for price this week. So just a heads up, if things go a little slow and I'm switching charts, it's because my internet's a little slow. Hopefully we won't have any issues, but that may be the case. Okay, we're good. So in this case, you can see here the QQQ on the weekly side of things. We do have the same exact bull flag breakout here. The one thing I want to point out is anchoring the volume by price from this capitulation point. We did have quite a volume shelf here forming. Nice launch pad here this week. Definitely a bull flag breakout and an ascending triangle breakout on the daily chart. You could see here that we did have this blue raindrop right at the apex of this ascending triangle. And remember, just because we have a blue raindrop does not mean a reversal to the downside, especially in a consolidation zone like this. This generally is more biased to the upside than the downside. And that's exactly what we got on Friday today. We got a nice move up. We have a lot of volume at the top of the range showing buyers are clearly in control here, and definitely could be an interesting week going into the week ahead. Now, the one thing that I want to point out here is IWM, which really outperformed everybody and started to fill the gap. And this is one of the few charts that still has this initial gap below from February 24th, if you want to call it the COVID gap or whatever you want to call it. It finally is starting to fill here. The one thing I want to point out is there wasn't a ton of volume at the top of the range here, something that we did see on SPY and QQQ, but not as much here on IWM. But we did have a really strong week, and this is something that we did have something a little different last week, but this was clearly a flag just like the Qs and SPY. Nice breakout, possibly going to test all-time highs. It would make sense if risk is on at this point, so we'll just have to see what happens. Now, the one thing that I do want to go over is the VIX. The VIX, for such a strong week, actually did not necessarily pull back as much as you would have thought. We're still actually holding this kind of right shoulder here on the weekly chart. We still also have a gap below here on both charts, so that's something to keep in mind too. But I mean, look at this inverse head and shoulders. Now, you have to remember VIX isn't always going to act like a typical stock because it is a derivative of a bunch of different things that can't really be accounted for a lot of the time on the chart side of things. But we still do have like this inverse head and shoulders, which is really interesting. So here's your left shoulder, here's your right shoulder. If we do break down into the coming week, this is definitely going to be invalidated, but for now, it actually is holding rather well. So that's the broad market update. We'll have to see what happens into next week, but the charts are looking pretty strong. Now let's go over the charts that we have been going over the last couple weeks, starting with AMD here. Not a perfectly symmetrical head and shoulders here, but we do have that kind of that formation going on. We have this diagonal support zone to the downside if we did continue down. Remember, if you did want to be alerted anytime the price gets to this area, you can just go and create this sensitivity zone with however much sensitivity you want to use. Now, on the weekly side of things, we had the anchored volume by price from this June capitulation point. And so you can see here that we did have kind of this area here that was acting as a pretty strong volume shelf that we've been identifying for the last couple weeks. This did act as a level of interest for buyers, and we did have a move up. Now, this week was not the prettiest as far as candles go, so we'll have to see what happens next week. But notice that we closed right within this other volume shelf here, and notice how well the price was able to move through this volume gap last week into this week. So that's AMD, not the most bullish chart, especially with strength in the market, but we'll have to see what happens going forward. CRM is one that really had a pretty strong week here. We have this ascending triangle that broke out. I also want to point out the raindrop here because the raindrop did have quite a bit of volume above the resistance zone on the ascending triangle. So before we do that, while that's loading, we can go over the weekly chart, and you guys can see this this volume shelf is something we've been identifying really for quite a while here, the last couple weeks, and we talked about this initially being an area of supply. It finally, we finally got some equilibrium here on the supply and demand. Supply dried up, and we had a huge launch pad off of this volume shelf here. So will we get clear skies up to the next level of resistance above in the 320s? That would be pretty epic, but we'll just have to see what happens. However, did want to point out this nice bounce off the volume shelf, and now that we have the weekly chart open, you can see here that we do have quite a bit of volume above this line on Wednesday, had the blue raindrop, and then a continuation on Friday. And notice here, a lot of that volume is at the top of the range, essentially showing us that there is quite a bit of conviction by buyers at the top of the range. Remember, you have to have a seller and a buyer to have volume. The thing that we're focused on the raindrop is the fact that a lot of that volume is aggregating at the top of the range here on Friday's raindrop candle. Going into LULU, we did have a nice gap fill finally for LULU. The gap fill is something that we've been talking about for a while now. Sorry, it's taking a little long to load here. My internet's a little slow today. However, we do have this gap snake. Remember, the gap snake is automated gap detection. If we turn it on, we can see that this gap filled fully from when we initially really identified it back a couple weeks ago. So this is fully filled. And also, if you guys remember, this volume shelf that we've been talking about the last couple weeks has really acted as a level for price to move up from, and really strong last 3 weeks here. So going into SQ, another really cool case study on SQ, because we essentially tested that resistance zone almost perfectly. We did break through a little bit today on Friday, but you can see here, this was the resistance zone that the automated trend detection did pick up a couple weeks ago. We broke out of this barely in kind of a falling wedge, if you want to call it like a pennant looking thing here. And then we finally moved right up to this resistance above, almost nailed it, and even a little higher today on Friday. So really strong move on SQ over the last couple weeks, which was indicative of this ascending triangle breakout on the weekly side of things. And you can see here that we've just had 3 weeks of straight up movement and really a strong bounce off this volume shelf here as well. Not as pronounced of a volume shelf as you'd think, but still quite a bit of volume aggregating here, and clearly a base for price to move up over the last couple weeks through this ascending triangle. So strong week on SQ. SE is another one that had a very strong week. So if you guys look at, we'll start with the weekly chart here. We've been talking about this volume shelf forming, pretty much aggregating, the volume was aggregating here, but really anchoring the volume by price from this capitulation candle here. You can see that this has been really acting as a volume shelf for the last couple weeks, and then finally price has kind of stair-stepped up this volume shelf. Now on the daily side of things, the main thing that we want to focus on here, especially intra-week on, what was this, Tuesday, we had this horizontal level of resistance that had been acting as resistance for quite a few days here. We can do a double trend line here to kind of highlight some of these lower areas here. But the main thing was seeing a lot of this volume on the raindrop above this resistance zone. And that's something that is really powerful going into a breakout. Anytime you see conviction by the buyers above a horizontal level of resistance, clearly buyers in control. And then with this this breakout here on the weekly, I mean, this thing could be clear sailing to this upper trend line here. We'll just have to see what happens. But a really strong week for SE. And going into ROKU, a strong week for ROKU as well. If you guys remember the ascending wedge that we were pointing out last week, we pretty much broke right through it and then some. And I don't think, from what I remember looking at this chart earlier, yeah, the raindrop wasn't as strong as you would have thought. However, I do want to point this out. Kind of the theme today is really all of that volume above these resistance zones. So when we did break out, we did have a red raindrop, but notice quite a bit of that volume was aggregating above the range compared to this candle when it tried to break out. There was literally no volume. It was flat. So seeing that volume above the resistance zone is really crucial to see who was in control, which it was clearly buyers here. So the ascending wedge has been broken out of, and this ascending triangle on the weekly chart continues to break out. And you guys can see here that this volume shelf highlighted in green really was a base for price to have a lift off here. So all in all, really strong week for ROKU as well. Let's go to PTON. I mean, at this point, everybody's had a strong week. PTON, absolute rip. We've been identifying this kind of very slight broadening channel here. We finally did break out. The main thing I want to point out here is that balloon breakout on Wednesday, which really told us buyers were in control. We had a little bit of a pullback on Thursday before just an absolute rip on Friday today, and really new all-time highs here, and volume clearly showing buyers are still in control at the top of the range here. So I know there were quite a few firms or institutions trying to short this way back in the day, and kind of like Tesla, they're probably just getting absolutely destroyed here, and some of them are probably getting margin calls at this point. I mean, or who knows, maybe they already have had them, but this thing just continues to rip to the upside. If we count the candles at this point, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 candles in a row, just pretty much straight up. If we anchor the volume by price from this March low, you guys can see that volume shelf was really forming, and just really clear that buyers were in control, and there were shares aggregating here in distribution going on, and a ton of accumulation as well. But you know, pretty much the anchored volume by price is just showing us where that distribution of shares is across different price points. And so at this point, we always want to anchor from this capitulation point, and just a huge volume shelf here acting as a launch pad for price. So going into Apple, I got to admit, Apple is just looking absolutely fantastic into next week. Remember, just because I say it looks fantastic, that doesn't mean go and buy it on Monday. But just from a chart setup, it is a very strong setup going into the week ahead. So you can see here on the daily raindrop, there's quite a bit of volume at the top of today's range. Not as much as you'd love to see something like this, but notice that this didn't always continue up either. What we really want to see is we want to see a breakout through a horizontal level of resistance. So for example here, we can see that there was top volume at the top of the range here, but if we draw this area, like let's say we want to draw a trend line right around here, we're pretty much stuck right at this resistance zone. So this is something we definitely need to break through to get some momentum here. We still have that inverse head and shoulders forming, and notice that this is kind of late to the party. So is this going to be a laggard into next week? We'll just have to see, but definitely still the inverse head and shoulders in play here. If we draw a neckline, I would say, you know, we'd do a double trend line neckline right around here. So it definitely still has to prove itself, and this could be something that helps bring the markets higher into the week ahead. Now, the main thing that I want to tell you guys and show about the volume shelf here, and kind of the main setup that I'm looking at, is just this absolutely beautiful volume shelf forming, a ton of shares holding at break even here. As soon as those shares stop selling and we have any type of increase in demand, we don't even have to have an increase in demand. We just have to have relative demand staying the same and supply decreasing for the price to go up. And that's kind of what we saw this week, and really setting up very strong in the next week. If we anchor an Alpha Trends anchored VWAP here, you can see that we finally did close above this this all-time high anchored VWAP. So that is also showing that buyers are clearly in control into the week ahead. So Apple really strong. GRWG, an absolute massive move to the upside, just like we were talking about here on the volume shelf. Remember, the volume shelf was showing us that there's just a huge amount of volume holding here. Remember, we want to anchor the volume by price from this capitulation point in March, and you can see just how much volume there was, which is really acting as a base for price, and that's exactly what we got, a huge move up this week. And if we look at the daily chart, you can see this Alpha Trends anchored VWAP pinch here that finally broke out as well. The main thing I want to point out here is the fact that there was quite a bit of volume above this Alpha Trends anchored VWAP. We retested this anchored VWAP perfectly and then continued up on Friday. However, this isn't the strongest raindrop I've ever seen. Notice that during the second half of the day, some of that volume was starting to create new lows in price. So we'll have to see how that goes into next week. But all in all, very strong setup here, and quite a move in GRWG, but also all wheat stocks. So congrats to those that were in the wheat stocks. Last one we're going to go over is Big Lots. So remember, Big Lots last week, we had kind of a weird week, pretty much closed right where we started. But pretty much going into the week ahead, we have a pretty strong weekly candle here. And you can see here a couple things. As I mentioned, the raindrops with volume above resistance is kind of the theme on this video. You can see that the volume above resistance here, let's make this red to show that it was previous an area of resistance. Strong volume above the resistance zone. Nice move up today. Kind of a weird candle, but still quite a bit of volume at the top of the range here on Friday. And going on to the weekly side, we can see that we finally did start to move up. Just a ton of volume holding here. And so you can see here that we did start to kind of stair step up this area, and we'll just have to see what happens going into the next week. Now, the last thing I want to go over is FSLY. I know I said we were just going over 10, but let's add a couple more. FSLY is one that just had an absolute rip to the upside. I mean, absolute rip. So, if we draw this broadening formation here, this was actually a broadening formation that we saw from automated trend lines. So remember, the automated trend lines pops up, and then I have the ability to choose which lines that I want to lock in. In this case, I locked in kind of this broadening formation. I mean, if we went straight up from here, we're talking 150s, 160s if this thing continues up. One thing that I want to point out here is the fact that we did break out of this horizontal level of resistance. Lots of volume at the top of the range here on the daily raindrop. And then that volume shelf. I mean, look at the volume shelf here, just absolutely on the weekly chart, showing a ton of volume here. And we could even make this kind of a diamond top breakout here. So just a quick little drawing here. Obviously, we'd want to remove the arrows, but same thing. We've got this diamond forming, nice breakout. Huge move off the volume shelf this week, and I mean, over the last couple weeks at this point, but just a textbook move using the volume shelf. Remember, the volume shelf is just showing where a ton of shares are aggregating, and this usually creates a base for price. The last one I want to go over, let's go over one more, Boeing. Boeing is one that we went over last week. From what I remember, I think we were talking about the supply zone above. So if we anchor the volume by price from this area, notice that we were talking about a lot of supply up here shown by the anchored volume by price, but also the anchored VWAP. We have not broken through this anchored VWAP and closed through it. Even though we've tried multiple times shown by these wicks, we have just not been able to get through this supply zone. So we'll just have to see what happens in the coming weeks. This thing is still absolutely beaten down from where it originally started, in the 300s and 400s. And so we'll have to see if we can finally get through this area. Remember, if you watched the last couple videos, a lot of these charts, initially this acts as supply, and then it acts as a demand zone once the price gets through it and can get some momentum from there. So all in all, a very strong week for stocks. Maybe some were stronger than other, but all in all, definitely some interesting stuff going on. If you do look at the Boeing chart here, we even have an inverse head and shoulders here as well. So, pretty much inverse head and shoulders galore across the board. Let me make this a little prettier so it looks a little more like an inverse head and shoulders. But all in all, just a lot of setups going into the week ahead, and excited to see what happens. So thank you all for watching. Remember, if you are not a customer of TrendSpider yet, we do have a 7-day free trial. You can try out all of these different features for free. And then if you find out that you like some of these features and you want to go into a trial, it's completely free for 7 days, and we can even extend that to 14 if you need more time. So thank you guys so much for watching. Everybody have a great weekend, and over and out.